Thank you guys for coming in today. I know it's we're probably all kind of at that point where it's been a very long week. So I am Jen Kraxner. I just I'm here to talk to you guys a little bit about third-party risk management and identity and access management, and how the two of those really should be quite tightly coupled and should really talk to each other. So you can't spell third-party risk management without IAM. Just by way of introduction, so I am currently the Vice President of Market Strategy for a company called SecZetta. We are a technology and identity solution that really addresses third-party, non-employee identity. But prior to doing what I do now at SecZetta, I've actually spent a lot of time engaged with a number of different industries and some different government agencies. So early in my career, I spent time working in counterintelligence and intelligence and personnel security and different types of security with the FBI, the NSA, and the Department of the Army for a number of years. Most of my time, again, as an agent was very much focused on kind of that intelligence, counterintelligence investigations, and really focused a bit on risk, but in a little bit different way than what we traditionally think of as third-party risk. Still also very focused on identity, even though at the time I did not realize that I was working in identity as a special agent. But we'll talk a little bit about why that is as we move through. I did start at the NSA in January of 2001, which was a very interesting year to be working in counterintelligence and counterterrorism and that kind of thing, as you can imagine. But like I said, for the last decade or so, I've actually been focused very much on identity and access management, working as a consultant for Optiv for a number of years, working with all different sorts of industries, from healthcare to higher education to financial institutions. So have really dug in deep on identity, on different forms of access management, and most recently, again, on third-party identity and third-party risk. So to start with that, I know there's been a lot of conversation this week in particular about different breaches, particularly different third-party breaches. So I think I've sat in at least half a dozen sessions where SolarWinds came up. Is everybody really familiar with what happened with the SolarWinds breach? Pretty familiar. I know I actually was semi-familiar until recently when I really kind of dug into it. But one of the key pieces of the SolarWinds breach, if everybody, for those that aren't familiar, the SolarWinds breach really had to do with somebody gaining access or an organization gaining access to SolarWinds systems, and I believe it was through a guest password. It was like not guest as in a visitor, but a guest like they were guessing passwords. And they got in and planted some malicious code within the Orion product, which was used by thousands and thousands of different companies and government agencies, right? And in so doing that, it actually went into a software update, I believe. And that update went out to customers. Once it was downloaded and implemented at those different customer sites, it actually allowed those threat actors to gain access to the systems at those different customers, right? And so this is what we would call a supply chain attack, but in the sense that SolarWinds was the supplier, right? And all of those different customers were now victim of that supply chain attack from the threat actor. Now, these attackers originally, again, compromised based on guessing passwords, which we can think a little bit, and this is going to come up a little bit more throughout this talk. When we think about third-party risk management, does anybody work closely with third-party risk teams, a GRC, do security questionnaires, all those sorts of things? One of the key things that our third-party risk programs are doing is assessing and evaluating security procedures and practices at organizations, right? So we understand, hey, do we have good password management? Do we have good password policies at these organizations so that hopefully we can prevent some of those things? Earlier this year in January, there was another breach of a technology that was actually traced back to third parties originally. Is anybody familiar with the Okta breach? Right? So Okta is, as I'm sure most of you know, an identity security company, right? They do multi-factor authentication. They do all of these amazing, wonderful things to help us improve identity security, and they were actually victim of a third-party breach. In that case, it was that somebody gained access to one of Okta's third-party contractors, right? So I think one of their system, I think it was an outsourced administrator, right? They got access to SecZetta, I believe was the name of the third party to Okta. They gained access to an engineer's device, and that device was then used to access customer environments. They really, I think, only got access to some different applications, Jira and Slack, I think. They didn't seem to do much damage. And the impact of the event was certainly much less than, say, a SolarWinds event, but that's, I guess, really when you're talking about the impact to the customers, right? The impact to Okta's reputation, however, was very significant to Okta, right? So that's another example of a third-party breach that we're going to talk a little bit today about how can we start, number one, or how can we do a better job of preventing these types of attacks, or there's certain things that we can do, certain things that we can implement to prevent the attack, but then at the same time, I know a big part of it is just the response to those sorts of events. And what I'll talk about today also will kind of contribute to how do we better respond to events like this and maybe more quickly respond to an event like the Okta breach or the SolarWinds attack. So before I jump into kind of the actual nuts and bolts of doing this, let's talk a little bit about identity and a little bit about third-party risk. I know having had an identity background, I spent a little bit of time having to kind of brush up on third-party risk when I came over to SecZetta in the role that I am there, because traditionally, identity, as an identity consultant, I really wasn't very focused on third-party risk, right? So as an identity consultant working in that industry, I was very focused on what truly identity and digital identity is. And I guess the first question I have to ask is, what is identity? When I say identity, what does that mean to you in your roles? Any one or two words that, I've already probably said one, multi-factor authentication, right? That has to do with identity. Passwords, absolutely. What, accounts? Yeah, accounts. So these are all right along those lines, right? You think about, and the truth is, sometimes I talk to audiences that are very focused on third-party risk, or maybe don't know anything about cybersecurity in general, and maybe they're more focused on governance, risk, and compliance. And identity can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It can be driver's licenses and credit reports, and if my identity is stolen, it doesn't have a whole lot to do with my accounts and passwords. It has more to do with my identity, my credit score gets affected, and so on and so forth. But if we really think about what digital identity is, it's a digital representation of a person in cyberspace, right? So we have multiple identities when it comes to our digital identity, right? We probably have identities from a social media perspective. We have an identity in healthcare, right? Our electronic medical records probably have an identity that we kind of roll up to. And then at work, we have an identity. And technically, some of us, especially if we're in the consulting realm or in any sort of, or if our company is a third-party vendor of some sort, which many of us, that's kind of what we are. We might have multiple work identities. So as an Optiv consultant, I had my Optiv identity where I had to access all of the systems to do my job there. But then if I was consulting for an organization, I might also have an identity there because I needed access to SharePoint, or I needed access to some system that we were working on. So I might have a lot of different identities, all of which really need to be managed in a very effective way, and many accounts that need to be managed, passwords, I've got all of these different things that I've got to kind of understand, depending on which identity I'm assuming at that point in the day. But really, the truth about digital identity, there's a lot of different things that identity professionals have to be focused on that really we have to balance. So key concerns from an identity perspective are usually efficiency, right? Especially if you're talking about work and your kind of workforce identity. Efficiency is a big part of any work that we do in identity, because we want to make sure that you as a new employee come in and get access in a quick manner, or me as a consultant, as a contractor, when I come in to do work that I'm being paid to do, I get access to the right things that I need to get access to, and it happens quickly. And even more importantly, right, when I leave, that access is removed, and in a very efficient way, right? But we're also focused on privacy, making sure that we're keeping all the information private that needs to be private, PII or healthcare information or the like. And then identity teams are also obviously focused on security, so protecting the information and the data and the assets of different organizations. So all of this is really about making sure the right people have the right access at the right time. And anybody that's been in identity, you hear that over and over and over again, right? But we do that all while accounting for privacy regulations, business efficiency, less friction, the end user experience. I mean, that's a huge concern right now. We think about why are organizations implementing SSO, for example. Well, it's to help with that end user experience. I can't remember 20 different passwords, so I probably better have a way to get into my systems with one. Yeah. Otherwise, I'm going to write them all down, because I'm going to find out what the easiest way is to get that. And so we're all very focused on this efficiency, the privacy, the security, and oh, by the way, don't forget about zero trust, right? And zero trust is like, it's incredibly difficult for the identity team at an organization, because our whole purpose is we have to trust somebody. Before you're going to give them access, you've got to trust them. As a counterintelligence investigator, I spent a lot of years doing background investigations. That's how you cut your teeth coming in that field. And my job was to determine how trustworthy somebody was, so that we could give them access to sensitive or classified information. Yeah. So you can't give people access, which identity teams that's one of their core things, right? You can't give them access to something without some level of trust. So zero trust is a very difficult thing for us to kind of wrap our heads around. Although it is certainly core. You always have to verify. I guess it's never trust, always verify, and so we're always trying to do that. So that's kind of the my take on identity, right? Now let's think about third-party risk. So I see a couple folks in here that work pretty closely with a third-party risk management team or a GRC team and the like. And third-party risk is certainly I would say they're considered quite separate at most organizations. Doesn't really line up with an identity team. Quite frequently, third-party risk teams don't even have the same reporting structure, because they're going up to like a chief risk officer or a GRC team or something of that nature. So an identity team might roll to a CISO or even a COO. They go in different directions, right? But third-party risk teams, for anybody that's not familiar there, it's all about assessing and mitigating the risk associated with doing business with third parties. So as we engage a third party, we engage our supply chain, we engage our business partners, there comes a certain amount of risk with that, the same as there would be risk with hiring a new employee, but it's treated very differently, right? So how are we achieving kind of these third-party risk management efforts? What are we doing to understand the risk that third parties bring to us? There's a lot of different ways we can gather that information. And I know there was a session in this room yesterday, if anybody was part of it, we were talking about supply chain and kind of the sources of all the information for the global supply chain, and that should absolutely impact the risk that doing business with vendors have for an organization. So there's publicly available information in many instances that we can use to assess the risk of a vendor. There's also, we rely heavily on questionnaires, right? If anybody's ever been part of a acquiring software, you have this nice security questionnaire that you send off to the vendor, and the vendor has to answer all these questions. I'm SOC 2 compliant. Yes, we do pen testing, and we do all of these things, right? So the vendor in that case is self-reporting and saying, yep, we're following all the right things that you need us to follow from a security perspective. There are absolutely some weaknesses to that approach, right? We're kind of trusting our vendors to tell us the truth about these things. Very seldom do we actually look for proof, with the exception of having to see a SOC 2 audit, right, or a SOC report. But we are trusting them to do some of this for us. The interesting thing about third-party risk is, at most organizations, it's not organically born as a security initiative, right? It's what? It's a compliance initiative, right? And while the intent of the regulations is to be more secure and to mitigate risk and to, help us kind of manage that risk, most organizations don't approach it that way, right? We're not looking at it from the perspective of this should inform what we do from a security perspective. We look at it as, well, that box is checked. Now I'm going to take that risk survey, I'm going to take the questionnaire, I'm going to take the report, I'm going to take whatever it is, and I'm going to put it in this drawer or this shared folder, and I'm not going to think about it again until next year we have to do it, like when we have to redo it on an annual basis or whenever we have to redo it. So the unfortunate consequence of that is that it's not, at most organizations, it's not true operational risk mitigation or enterprise security. It is instead, just like I said, a check in a box that says, yep, we've done this, and now we're going to move on to our next compliance regulation, our next audit. One nice thing is many organizations are kind of starting to make this shift for third-party risk, where they're not looking at it so much as a static exercise, like a static report and a single exercise on a vendor, but instead it's very dynamic. So we're doing things like, number one, reassessing on a regular basis, but number two, keeping an eye on different solutions. Like I think it was in Teros yesterday. We've also got the BitSight security scorecards, all of these different third-party risk solutions that can give us real-time information about the changes in the risk scores for different vendors. So a lot of organizations are starting to rely more on that so that we can have a better, and I'm sure that's a result of some of these third-party breaches, right? Because we can start really understanding, hey, if SolarWinds is breached, we want to make sure that we know that right away. We don't want to take any longer amount of time to kind of address it from a customer's perspective. So these are some of the, this is kind of the background between identity and third-party risk. Yeah. Does anybody here know if your organization, does identity know a lot about third-party risk, and does third-party risk know a lot about identity? Is there anybody who those two teams work closely together? That's great. What we've found as an organization, so it looks like there's a couple of you out there, that's pretty typical. 5 to 10% of organizations say that they are, that these two teams within their enterprise actually even know about each other, right? They even care what each other is doing. So it's not very much, but I'm going to talk a little bit today about why we should be talking, right? Why those two teams really need to be more tightly coupled than they are. First big reason is that third parties are being engaged more and more, especially these days, right? We have the extended enterprise is just growing and growing at many organizations. And we work with a lot of, at SecZetta, we work with a whole lot of customers who non-employees, third parties, business partners, these external people actually outnumber their employee populations, right? So it's growing and growing, and this is obviously a result of a lot of things from the pandemic, obviously kind of increased the need for that from a healthcare volunteer perspective, bringing in folks to man vaccine sites or do contact tracing, that was another thing. I mean, these are not employees that are coming in to do these things. These are volunteers, these are third parties, these are external folks that are really handling that. And one really interesting statistic is that, and this was from a Ponemon Institute study a couple of years ago, found out that 61% of the folks that they talked to had a breach that could be traced back to a third party. Okay, so it's in some way traced back, whether that was compromised credentials, whether it was a compromised device, whatever the case may be. 61% of respondents in this survey said that they had something that could be traced back to that. But then 66% of those respondents said they really didn't have any idea how many third-party relationships they had. They couldn't tell you how many third parties had access to their information. They really couldn't tell you much about third parties, okay? And I loved yesterday one of the sessions that Kevin Mandia was speaking at, and he said one of the best ways to find out how many third parties you might have, how many relationships, at least with organizations you might have, is to go talk to your CFO and say, hey, how many people are we paying outside of our organization? And that'll just give you some idea of the number of organizations, right? But it will not tell you how many people from those organizations we're actually giving access to. So what I can tell you is it's growing. It's growing a lot and it's growing quickly. So we really need to start putting more focus on identity and access of these third parties, and just as much focus as we're putting on our employees, and just as much focus as we're putting on doing the risk assessments at the organizational level. So to talk about why it's so important that third-party risk and identity start working together and start talking to each other and start informing each other, let's take things, scale it down just a little bit, okay? So this is a picture of my home that I bought, 6 years ago probably. Needed some updating, right? The garage doors fortunately are gone. But this house was, from the 1970s. It had this old kitchen that you can see there. And so my husband and I took it upon ourselves to renovate. All right, it needed some work. We kind of ended up taking this little kitchenette out and turning this whole room into a bedroom. And I was super excited. I'm a huge HGTV fan, and I thought this was going to be so fun and so easy. It was nothing like the shows, but still very enjoyable. The key piece here is, though, that I needed to hire a general contractor, right? I knew that I wasn't going to be able to do all of this work myself, even if I had all these brilliant ideas on how to renovate this house. But I had to hire a general contractor, and of course that GC was going to have to hire a bunch of other folks to come in and do the tile work, the carpet work, the trim work, the painting, the demo, the framing, everything that we had to do to get this project done. So being the suspicious, person that I am, and having all this history and doing investigations and research, the first thing I did was go out and research general contractors, right? I was like, okay, who am I going to bring in to do this for me? So I get on all of the typical places, Yelp, Angie's List. We've got Google, for that matter. Home Advisor, I think, is another one. So there are a lot of different places for me to go to get information about GCs, yeah? And I did that. And I said, all right, I'm going to go find the one with the best reputation, with the best ratings, all of these things, yeah? Very similar to selecting a vendor, right? And doing these risk assessments and understanding doing negotiations, doing all of those things, okay? So I spent a lot of time doing this. One other thing that's important to know about this project is, so my husband works in cybersecurity. He has always kind of been on the network security side, and he loves home automation and he loves gadgets, yeah? So we have cameras, we have the Ring doorbell, we have the electronic keypads to get into our home, and then we have some of the basics, the deal to get into the garage, all of that stuff. And he's also, dare I say, more suspicious than I am, right? And doesn't trust anybody. So you can bet that he was going to be kind of watching everything that was happening as it was happening. He also insisted on our general contractor and every single tradesperson having their very own door code so that we knew exactly when they could get in, and we could activate and deactivate those codes so that, when the tile work was done, the guy that was doing the tile work no longer had access to our home. All right. So, as we're working through this renovation, that's exactly what happened. We hired a GC. The GC was great. He understood how we were going to give people access to the home because Joe and I traveled all the time. So, there were definitely times when we weren't going to be there. So he understood what our security policies were, right? He understood that we needed to we needed to request a door code anytime he brought in a new person. That person should have their very own. They shouldn't share those door codes. Shared accounts, guys, terrible when it comes to third parties and prevalent everywhere. He knew all of this stuff, our GC did. And in reality, our project went great, right? The reno was fantastic. Of course, it's 5 years later, and we still have little things that we're trying to finish and that aren't done, but we're not having to bring any contractors into our home anymore. But let's think a little bit about some of the things that could have happened, right? Because throughout this whole process, I still did things like checked Yelp, and I still did things like looked at Home Advisor, and I still kind of checked in on my GC, and I even, when I knew who he was going to use for the tile work, or when I knew who he was going to use to install carpet, I would check those people out, right? And I would try to understand how much can I trust this person? Do I really think that they're going to do a good job for me? And everything was fantastic with the exception of a trim guy who we won't talk about. But the truth is, what if I, as my home's third-party risk person, what if I had checked Yelp one day and found out that the people that were installing my carpet had gotten a bad review because they left the garage door open at somebody's, at one of their other customers' homes, and a bike was stolen out of that garage while they were installing the carpet. All right, let's say that in my research, I find out that this happens. Okay, couple things that were places my mind would go. Number one is how careless. They didn't have great security practices if they're just leaving my garage door open and people, can come in and take stuff. The other thing is, what if one of the people that were there installing carpet took the bike? Yeah, so I can start, regardless of which one of those two things it is, my trust in that contractor goes down. And I probably should have a conversation with my GC about that, yeah? And say, hey, we need to make sure that we're, number one, reinforce what our practices are here, and number two, maybe I actually don't even want that person in my home anymore, in which case, we probably say, hey, go find somebody else to do this. But regardless, that should probably, as that person kind of researching and understanding those people that have access to my home, I probably should let this affect how risky I think this particular vendor is, this particular contractor is. Another kind of example here is, let's say that that Joe, so my husband, who's checking all the door codes and watching the logs and understanding who has access, who's gaining access to our home, notices that on a Saturday, my general contractor's door code was used, but we know that he wasn't there, and we know the only work that was being done was by our landscaper. We had somebody out doing some concrete work for us. Zero reason for that person to be coming into our home, and definitely no reason for them to have have the GC's door code to get in, because we specifically told him don't give it to them, right? In that case, what should happen? Well, if this happened after the carpet installer bike, thing happened, then maybe we're starting to get multiple strikes against this contractor, and we need to start thinking maybe they're too risky for us to be giving access to our home, right? But regardless, again, it's a time to counsel and coach our GC on proper security and why it's so important for us. Because after all, this is our home. This is what we treasure the most, right? But obviously, it's really important for us to, number one, keep an eye on things like that, understand when access is being used inappropriately to our house. So that's on Joe, right, who we're going to talk about, my husband, who is my identity team. He's the one giving access and kind of managing that access of people. And then on the other side of the coin, me making sure that I, kind of inform the GC about problems that I see from a security perspective, or that I inform Joe about, hey, I noticed that a bike came up missing where our GC or our carbon installer is having work done. So my point here is that kind of the key piece is here that this was a very small scale project, right? And we have maybe a little less, to us it's important, our home is important, the things in my home are important to me. Maybe definitely less to protect, though, than, say, an enterprise that's letting hundreds and sometimes thousands of contractors and third parties into your environment, right? Yes, it's absolutely important to assess those vendors and organizations from that kind of top-level third-party risk perspective, but it is just as important to keep an eye on what the people from those vendors are doing as they come in and get access to your home, right, or to your organization. And the other thing that kind of is important to recognize here is that while we spend a lot of time trying to understand third-party risk at that org vendor level, so that higher level, we can't ignore the risk of individuals that come from those vendors. So we can't ignore that one person that comes in from a contractor might have a very, very different risk than the company as a whole, right? Because maybe there's reasons for me not to trust this person for all sorts of different things that we really don't have visibility to if we're just looking at third-party risk assessments and those questionnaires, right? So how do we really tackle this? How do we start getting folks to talk to each other? And I guess before we really think about that or start talking about that, the first thing that I kind of want to point out is when it comes to third-party identity, like third-party vendors and the identity and the access that they get within an organization, most identity programs fall short to manage those populations of people. So see if this sounds familiar. Okay, first we'll talk about employee workforce identity. What drives your employee identities within your organization? Does anybody know what kind of the main source of information, the main thing that kind of drives all the life cycle is? HR. Yeah, an HR system. Yeah, we rely on Workday or PeopleSoft or Lawson or whatever that HR system is to help us know this employee is starting at this point in time. They retired here, they went on a leave of absence there. And if we're a really mature organization, we have IGA solutions, identity governance solutions that are in place that read that data and say, oh, let's go provision their access to the systems, or hey, this person is separated, let's go remove that access, right? And so we can get to be a pretty well-oiled machine. How do we manage, let's say, a contractor's access? Does anybody have an example? If you need to bring a contractor in to do some work, ticketing system, maybe? Yeah. What I've seen mostly is you got ServiceNow or Remedy or one of these, I guess Remedy is dating me a little bit, but Sharewell. Some of these different systems where we say, oh, I got to bring a contractor in, here's their name, here's the organization they're coming from, let's create a ticket, and now AD admin, Active Directory admin, or whoever it is goes in and says, yep, I'm going to put their employee number as C12345 so that I know they're a contractor, and we're going to provision their access, right? Very manual, right? No matter where you are, it's a very manual process. And most of the time, there are also checks and boxes that you have to get before you provision a contractor's access at an organization. So you have to do things like get them to sign a remote access agreement, or you have to These days, get them to attest that they've been vaccinated or sign off on some acceptable use policy. And then, by the way, we've got the manager out at the vendor that has to do some things and provide us some information. And so there's this game of telephone that's happening. There's just all of these very decentralized processes and people that have to contribute to that. So that makes for a very manual process when it comes to provisioning access for contractors or for third parties. And then once you've provisioned that, or once they have access, there's limited or really no validation after the fact to make sure that the information we have about somebody is still current, right? That it's still accurate, that we know that this project is still active, that this contractor still works for this vendor. There's not a whole lot of validation on that. And in reality, as a hiring manager, as somebody that onboards a third party, we don't really care to tell them when that third party's done with work. We really care about getting them access when they need to get access, but at the point in time that they're finished, we really don't care. So identity teams seldom hear that this person left and we need to deprovision their access. Instead, we rely on inactivity reports or something, right, or expirations. So there's very limited governance, no validation, and by the way, no indication on that third-party identity of how risky they are, because our third-party risk assessment is tucked in a drawer somewhere, and we don't even know, how risky their organization is for us. So we can't even use that because that's not a field in the ticket in ServiceNow, right? We don't have any clue how risky this person is. So, the key piece here is that we don't have real good authoritative information about third-party identities. And what's more, we don't even really interact with third-party risk teams when it comes to kind of understanding what risk these people bring to an organization. So this is really one of the core pieces here is that we have these two silos. We have our third-party risk team that's way over here, and we have our identity team that's way over here, and they barely even know the two exist, right? So just imagine if during my home renovation, I wasn't talking to my identity team, I wasn't talking to Joe, when I found out that, or if I found out that, in fact, the carpet installer did steal the bike because it was proven at some point, and I needed to fire that guy, right? I needed to tell my general contractor, we don't want this person back in our home. And so I told the general contractor this. The general contractor said, sorry, carpet guy, you're out. Yet I didn't tell Joe, take down his door code, right? What happens when the identity team and the risk team aren't talking to each other is you end up with bad actors that still have access. You have accounts that are still active that should be shut down. You have potentially breaches happening that throw up a third-party risk score and a flag, and that those people should, that entire organization should probably be shut down. There was an HR system that was breached earlier this year, right? Kronos, I think. And there were a lot of people with access from that HR company, to a lot of their customers. When they were breached, passwords, credentials show up on the dark web, whatever the case may be. You know that all of those employee passwords are out there. Let's be sure we shut down, suspend access for anybody with access to our systems as a customer, so that we can be sure we can be sure that we're not going to be breached as a result. Okay, so these are some of the problems with these silos. And there is, fear not, there is a way to kind of tie these things together, and I know I'm kind of getting tight on time here. So the key to being able to make this actionable, make these folks talk, is really that bringing in a third-party identity authority. So right now, what we have are these third-party risk management processes and teams over here. We have identity and access over here, the accounts, even the IGA tools, the governance, all of the things that are happening from a provisioning and deprovisioning perspective over here. What we're missing is what HR systems fill for employees. What we're missing is that middleman to say, let me inform the identity solutions about all of the relevant information for these third parties. And by the way, let me make sure that I'm keeping up to date with what my third-party risk team is doing. So we have a way for third-party risk information to travel down to the identity level. We have a way to say, hey, the risk of this organization went up. These are all the people that are working at that organization for us, that are engaged here from that organization. And here's their identities and their access on the other side. Okay, so we have this way to provide continuity, to centralize very decentralized things right now, right? Because it lives in a ticket, or it lives in a third-party risk assessment, or it lives somewhere completely outside of the identity ecosystem. We're just not able to connect those dots. But if we put this identity authority in place, we can start maintaining that information, and we can start making well-informed, risk-based decisions downstream on the identity side. So with that, I don't know if there's any questions. That was really what I wanted to talk to you guys about this morning. We have a few minutes, I think. Any questions from you guys?
So the third-party identity authority, roughly analogous to an HR system for managing third parties. Who stands that up? Are you talking about another external vendor or someone in-house doing that?
Yeah, so most organizations that are doing this, sometimes it kind of depends, is what I'm going to say. There are usually identity teams are the ones that start recognizing a need for it. So the identity team will drive something like that. But my experience has been sometimes HR has already drawn a short straw, and HR is already being asked, hey, go manage our third parties, even though that has nothing to do with what they should be doing, and even though they really don't have any better insight into third parties than an identity team or anybody else does. Sometimes it's HR, sometimes it's identity, sometimes it's a procurement team. Sometimes, every now and then, we even talk to third-party risk teams that are trying to set this sort of thing up because they see the need for it. But the important thing is that the repository, the authority itself, can be owned, and one team can be accountable for it, but the true nature of third-party identity authorities is that it has to be dispersed responsibility. Yeah. So SecZetta is one of these solutions that we kind of make it centrally managed, but again, the actual providing of the information needs to be decentralized. So we need to take information from third-party risk teams. We need to take information from a third-party vendor. We need to take information from that non-employee, the person themselves, and we need to take information from an identity team, and all of these different people really need to be able to contribute into that system so that we make sure we have the best information. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you guys very much. Off to the next.